expectations there. Yes, so thank you for that introduction. There are quite a few of us. I'm the second to last one on that list, Jasper. The reason for this is probably that this has been a project, an ongoing project for a while now at our department in Utrecht, and we are working together with a group of students and staff on this project that we have termed Analytical Game Design. And we're very glad, obviously, that we can talk a little bit about our recent endeavors in this project. I think also, I unfortunately wasn't here this morning, but I did see a lot of connections to talks yesterday, especially during the pedagogy session. The talk by, is it Sean and Jeffrey? I don't know if yeah. So I thought that was particularly interesting. Also, Robert's talk, where he emphasized process over output or end result, that rang specifically close to our project as well. So very happy to share some of this work. Just to give you a little bit of context, we presented, or at least Jesse presented, a paper at the previous Interactive Past conference a couple of years back on our Game On project. And that Game On project was a sort of first unified effort between the University of Utrecht and Beeld en Geluid as a cultural heritage institution to, as it says here, preserve, archive and exhibit the history of Dutch digital games. That ended in various interesting results. We collected quite a few of the old games that were at a critical point of almost being lost due to bit rot or software hardware compatibility problems. We also did a project on exhibition and preserving games with a focus on documentation. So we set up a Let's Play booth here in the museum and had people play the games to also think about preserving gameplay rather than the games themselves. And more recently, we actually worked on a Dutch canon of a canon of Dutch games. I think Jesse already mentioned this in on the first day, very briefly. So maybe we should emphasize that again near the end of the conference. That's being launched on Monday, am I correct? Okay. So yeah, and we've been lucky enough to be actively involved in that as well. And this project really ties into that, where we're thinking about designing games or designing small game vignettes, modifying games to think differently about canonization processes, about different histories of games, in this particular case, the Dutch history of games. So that's a process that we call analytical game design, which is really sort of method tying into what Robert has been talking about yesterday, to think about indeed the process of game design itself and how it can yield new insights into various other processes. This can be about the working of the game itself, but this can also be external processes like canonization or different histories. We should, maybe a small disclaimer here, we are not historical scholars. We are media scholars, game scholars, coming from various backgrounds, literature theory, film theory. So we know a bit about games, not so much about history. So just a small disclaimer there. If you tend to disagree on a certain element of this presentation, that might be the one. Luckily, Stefan is doing that part. And it's also a work in progress. So we will be showing the prototype that we currently have. We've also set it up in the coffee area for you to play. Although I've just learned that it crashes every time you do something. So it's a prototype. We're working on it. So yeah. So just to very briefly continue on from this to show you what the aims are of this project. As I said, we're trying to, through game design, we're trying to get a better insight into this massive list of, that you can see a small image here, or a large image here of this massive list of Dutch games from the 80s onward. Rather than visualizing or sonifying or haptifying games, we're trying to basically make these data sets playable, and Stefan will relate to this at the end of our talk as well. So specifically exploring this specific data set, right, the Dutch video games from the 80s until today. Also exploring different histories. So, so through that process of modding, changing small elements of the game, creating certain categories, we're trying to think of how that might yield different histories of Dutch games. So can we see a sort of trajectory in genres specifically, or platforms, or makers, for instance? And also the politics of the canonization process itself. So by playing around with this data set, we're trying to think about how that might also make us more aware of certain political, economic, social, cultural influences in that whole canonization process itself. So we're just going to be tossing the mic back and forth. So Stefan, you want to?
All right, since we proposed not just playing games or games in general, but specifically game making as a new medium for historiography, we should at least very briefly try to contextualize this by addressing the media specificity of previous historiographical work. So one of the core proponents of this, of course, is Hayden White, who's talking specifically about genres, how historical fiction and specific literary genres and literary tropes, character tropes, like story plots have become a filter through which we perceive history and organize historical data, of course. So he's talking about forms of historical realism in 19th century and the problems that come with applying these kinds of patterns of thinking in a non-reflective way. These are not just literary genres, but also he's talking about annals or list forms, so specifically, so this is what we would call a medium. I mean, a list is also a medium because it includes something, it excludes something, depending on the way it's presented, it can frame the subject matter in a particular way. And the game prototypes that we are making also fulfill that function, so it's important to be aware of that. White also specifically defines historiography as a practice that is situated between arts and science that applies both to categories of scientific rigidity but also to aesthetic categories. It cannot really, completely disassociate itself from them. And one turn that we found particularly interesting and that resonates with what we're trying to do, I think, is Kukkanen's proposition to embrace performativity in historiographical work. So he's basically pleading for moving past what he calls truth functional evaluations, like basically choosing the right narrative, so to speak, that is inherent in historical realism, and embracing the performativity of historical knowledge. And this is something that you see already in practice-based historiographical work. And what we found when we looked into some of these approaches like reenactment or prototyping is that these, historiographical practices are also inherently ludic in a sense. So reenactment, for example, performative methodologies. There's a big project that I think just concluded, Technique in the Arts, which has a strong reenactment component, which is about recreating the material environments of artists and trying to get an effective relationship to how these tools felt, what kind of practices they inspired, and how the material context of art production actually influenced the artworks. And also what I find really interesting is Sayer's notion of prototyping the past, where she's looking at media history, and she has developed something that she calls an early wearables kit, which you can see on the left there, for example. So they're also making tools, basically, and she's talking about a trend in 19th century, fashion, basically, about wearable electric gadgets that people already used, and so she's basically recreated a few of them, like the skull pin that you might be able to discern in the image on the left there, which actually had glowing eyes that worked with a little battery and with an electric current. So basically she's creating these wearable kits, and what I find interesting about this, because this is also a playful process, so she's making these things, it has an element of bricolage in it, if you consider Shirley Turkle. I mean, you're playing around with these material objects, and they give you a different, not necessarily streamlined idea of why people were making these things, what it meant to wear them, basically, as a form of social distinction, for example. So Sayer says that these kits serve as situations for research across meaning and matter, with an emphasis on the assumptions under which the skull stick, in this case, was made and used. And we consider our games actually to work in a similar manner. So basically, these practices already have a playful quality to them, and we try to make that more explicit and tap into that. So the method that we are using, analytical game design, Jasper already mentioned it, it's situated within practice-based game research. There are a few already, a few propositions on how to do that. For some reason, all of them have been published in and around 2015, as you can see in the reference list. And our main problems with them is that most of them actually, well, they don't really have an underlying methodology. They are reporting on a project, but they don't really give you any clues on how to perpetuate this, how to replicate this. And they're all focused on the creation of one game. So all of these, they are making one game and taking this game as an example. We so far also have only made one prototype, but this method that we are subscribing to basically involves creating, but also recreating and then comparing playable vignettes, small-scale playable applications that are not full-scale games with a menu and with a well-defined ending, but they are rough, unfinished in a sense. So we are believing in the politics of multiplicity, and also in productive irritations, in wrestling with the technological constraints. We are not computer scientists, obviously, but we try to use digital prototyping methods. And most importantly, we consider these prototypes, so we have made one so far, but we've already varied it a little bit, even though we're going to briefly show one version. But we consider these prototypes as objects in the research process that have a certain agency, as Mika Bar calls it, the concept of theoretical objects. So basically making these things and comparing them needs to be part of an ongoing process rather than an endpoint. And with that, I'm going to briefly show the prototype, and Dennis is going to describe it.
Yes. Okay, so it should pop up on the screen at some point, I think, from over there. It's not showing up on this big screen. And then, there we go. Yes, so the first thing to note is already that the sort of the visuals need a lot of refinement. Of course, we're focusing much on the actual process of playing the game. So it's a set making game, a sort of a tile matching game. So the screen is already filled with all the games in the Dutch canon. And they all have these metadata. You know, you have the genre, you have the developer, you have the year in which it was made, the audience it was made for, and you're supposed to make matches based on these data. So if you have 3 games made by the same developer, then you can line them up, and in the matching phase, you can sort of drag them together. That looks like this, and you score points on based on that. We haven't figured out the actual scoring system yet. That'll come, but we know that you will score points. And the more matches you make, and the more games are included in the match, the more points you score. That's kind of basically how it works. So on the bottom there. Oh right, shall we just skip back to the? We can. That's fair. Yeah. Like we said, it's also in the break area there. So if you want to check it out and get more information, we can talk about that. So as Stefan and Jasper have already mentioned, this is an ongoing process. So we still have a lot of ideas for potential tweaks, potential additions to the game that could change the way that it sort of frames the Dutch game canon, the way in which you understand it, because that's the whole point, right? Through playing it, you make sense of what this archive that we have built is. Kind of a recall to yesterday. So first of all, we want to note that historiography is primarily a narrative practice. Basically, you tell a story about what history has been, and that's the way that people learn what history is, kind of. So we want to kind of apply this same principle because we see narrativization and narrative as the main way of making sense of any kind of type of knowledge. So the idea is kind of what kind of stories do you make as you play through this canon. So what this kind of means for us is that we want to add some particular game mechanics, which we would dub narrative game mechanics. So game mechanics which can sort of create a narrative process in the embodied mind of the player, to use Doubleman's own definition. And we have some ideas for this. So one would be event-based rule modifiers, which is inspired partially by the dungeon cards in Munchkin, but we'll use an example that we already thought of for this game. So there have been over the years, researches and sort of moral panics about whether violent video games cause violence. And we thought, okay, so what if you at some point during play, this sort of pops up like, oh, there's another research that says that people who play first-person shooters, I don't know, want to kill babies afterwards. I don't know, something weird like that. So what happens then? Maybe whenever you make a match which includes the action genre or the first-person shooter genre, you get 50% less popularity points because people are far less interested in the actual sort of cultural legacy of first-person shooters because they think that it makes people violent and therefore it's not worth remembering. So this would be a type of story that you could create. Another mechanic would be contextual prompts, like in games like Plague Incorporated, where you have to sort of... So as you're playing the game, you are mostly sort of engaged with the game process. And we want, of course, people to also learn from the game that they are playing. So how do you do that? You sort of trigger this process of actually making the story. You make people aware that they are playing a story, that they are making a story. So you can do this, for example, by providing context. So this would be kind of part of the event-based rule modifiers, but they could also be contextual prompts like, I don't know, something other game-related happens. So a news article comes out that says that the game industry is now the largest media industry in the world, and you have this extra piece of context to make sense of our own little Dutch game canon. So these are kind of the things that we are still planning to add. But then there is a lot to say also about sort of the politics of canonization, which I know Jasper is a very big fan of. So I'll let him talk about that.
Okay. So aside from the narrativization process, we can also indeed think about the canonization itself. How can we indeed get into the role of the exhibition space in this case? So the game is very much about taking that role and highlighting continuities or discontinuities in the canon that we have. And by doing so, it might also help us to get new insights into indeed the different connections between these games. Potentially also highlight gaps in that canon by changing the different categories that we have. So changing, for instance, different genres there. We may also start to think about different exemplaries, right? So rather than taking the racing genre and use the sports genre, for instance, we may start to think about different examples that may be more exemplary for that specific genre, thereby also changing the canon towards a different direction. So this really ties into, for instance, Janet Steiger's work on the politics of canonization. She writes specifically about film canonization, but she has a very I'm a big fan of this specific paper. I've been talking extensively about this the last couple of days. Yeah, I know. So she talks about how the politics is at least threefold. So there's the politics of admission. In this case, we can think about indeed the politics of getting games into a larger category of the arts, which is what Steiger talks about. So also thinking about, for instance, big institutions and the authority of those institutions like MoMA, or in this case, thinking about games as part of a cultural heritage, what Beeld en Geluid is doing, and also the authority there. She also talks about the selection procedures itself, right? So we're excluding certain games, we're including certain games in that canon. That's also potentially steering the game industry, the Dutch game industry, into a certain direction. So those games will be referenced more in future products by critics, etc. So there's a very important sort of political aspect to it there. And finally, also the academy itself. So we as academics, in our writings, the critics also specifically focus on specific games, but there are also certain economic and reputation issues at stake there. So the way that the game is obviously interesting here is that by enforcing certain constraints on ourselves, so this specific game is obviously about a matchmaking mechanic, so we are forced to have only a few different genres, for instance. If we have 100 genres, it will be impossible to make a match, right? So we're enforcing certain constraints on ourselves. We need to think about specific genres, and then also already start thinking about, okay, so we have an action genre, but we need to have at least 3 games that have that genre, and if we don't find them, that's already giving us new insights into, indeed, the continuities and discontinuities in this specific canon. So we have to start thinking about a different genre. Also, with regards to the modifiers, for instance, this is an example that Dennis was also talking about briefly. So that also sort of highlights the situatedness of this specific canon, right? So the political rationales behind certain choices that have been made in the specific canon, and also potentially different choices that can be made. So to that extent, it might also give us new insights into that whole political, economic, cultural, social rationale behind certain choices in the canon. Yeah? Do you want me to talk about this? Yeah, okay. So just to briefly mention this, we also, since this is an ongoing process and we are making different games or different small games, we've been working on another second prototype, which is an analog prototype, a card game. So we're using the cards as a platform to be able to make different games with. This specific game should eventually also be sold in the gift shop in Beeld en Geluid as a sort of take-home product for visitors of the museum to learn about and play with the Dutch game canon. So the mechanics of these games are slightly different. So we can think about, for instance, a game focused on sequentiality, making timelines. So if we, for instance, think about the card having on one side the title and an image, and on the other side various other types of information, such as the year, there's a specific sort of timeline game that you can play with it, making different timelines with it, and then checking if that's correct, which is also starts you to get you thinking about indeed the sequentiality of different games, the continuities there. But we can also think about other matchmaking mechanics there as well, of course, on the basis of genre or other aspects. I don't know if you're familiar with the meta game. Has anyone ever played the meta game? Yeah? A few people? So the meta game is a game that was made by, among others, Eric Zimmerman, who's a famous game scholar you may know. And it's very much a sort of argumentative game. So you get a couple of cards and you start to argue why this game is, for instance, better than this game, or why this game should be in the canon or should not be in the canon, or why you think these games connect to each other. So to that extent, these card games can also yield us give us new insights into that whole canonization process itself. So, yeah.
All right, to basically wrap up this presentation, because I think we are already nearing or are even past the our deadline. So just to give a little bit of context about the broader idea behind this project. So this is our first example, but it's we consider game making as a methodology in general about making data sets playable. So there's also strong focus in Utrecht or at Utrecht University on critical data studies. And we are thinking about how games basically can be a medium to overcome what is usually called like the primacy of visual evidence in data studies. And in data studies, basically, you take a data set, you visualize it, usually in a two-dimensional medium or even as an interactive visualization, and then you are done with it, basically. But in recent years, there have been different forms of data analysis that tap into different sensory modalities. So we start with visualization, but people are also exploring sonification, turning data into sound, haptification with wearable devices, so turning data into tangible information, and also physical visualizations, which you can see on the left there. It's a bit of a strange term, physical visualization, but these use 3D printing to make data sets haptic, basically. So we are thinking about how to transcode data, and this can be historical data, and for several reasons, historical data lend themselves very well to this process, into games, basically. So if you consider John Waterworth, for example, who talks about digital media as synesthetic media, which are particularly suitable to translate between different modes of sensory perception. And, or Bernie de Koven, who talks about the sense of play. Obviously, playing is not a sensory modality, but it combines distinct sensory modalities in a particular way. And playing with this kind of data set, well, it's not the same as visualizing the data set. We could, for example, visualize the same data that we have, so then we would be able to quickly see which genres, for example, are particularly prominent at particular points in time. In the early 80s, what are the most common genres? This is something that you would be able to see more easily with the visualization than with what we are doing. But then again, we consider this to be a more, rather than a big data analysis, more like a rich small data analysis. You're always only playing with a subset of the data, and basically the game that we made really more simulates the position of a museum. So you're not constructing timelines, but you're curating a set of games in different ways to bring out particular similarities or dissimilarities, continuities in this particular canon. So yeah, so this is the first step towards this bigger goal. And with that, we thank you for your attention and are available for questions later.